Hello and welcome back to Rage Gaming in a new Elden Ring video. We are talking about the most powerful weapons in Elden Ring in terms of their straight output potential. Weapons that can deal the most damage in either, say, the shortest time or even a single hit. We're talking unique, powerful weapons that can easily be buffed up to outrageous levels of power, a list specifically for those unique weapons, rather than, say, X weapon with X affinity using X ash in X way, because otherwise this list would just be a lot of blood flame and a weapon, and then maybe attacks or ashes of war, which is less interesting or varied. 1.09 changed a lot though. A lot of weapon types had buffs or nerfs, and specific weapons had their Ashes of War majorly improved. In fact, 2 on this list are here because of that. So without any further ado, here are the 10 most powerful weapons in Elden Ring 1.09 for DPS in my opinion. Starting at number 10, it's Ghiza's Wheel. Yes, this one comes down to its Ash of War, which, as I just mentioned, had a specific Ash of War buff, the spinning wheel. They increase the attack generation speed, meaning it comes out and ticks faster. So like the chainsaw effect, it's just going to hit faster and more consistent. That means more damage, that means faster bleed procs, that means more AR, that means more successive hits. And so obviously the DPS potential has skyrocketed with this weapon, and it's finally in a pretty damn respectable place. In fact, the bleed potential on this weapon is one of the better options you have for bleed weapons in general. The downside is obviously getting stuck in that animation. You must wind it up, wear it up, and hold it on target, and that leaves you a bit vulnerable. That's where that second buff comes in, where they added a roll and heavy attack cancel while using the skill. So now you can cancel out of it whenever you want with a roll, or finish it with a heavy attack, do a bit extra damage before, say, getting out of the way of an interrupting attack. This is incredible for the weapon, and it finds itself in a much better state. So if you haven't played around with it, I honestly really recommend it. It's feeling really good. And it's true that bleed builds are nerfed in power 1.09 because the White Mask and Exaltation Talisman, those give you less AR when a bleed proc occurs, but it's still good ultimately, and of course we have successive hits. So Ghiza's Wheel makes it onto the list. Next is number 9, the Death Ritual Spear, which is another one with a very important unique Ash of War buff in 1.09. The Spear Call Ritual. Basically what they did with this one is increase the projectile generation speed. It's basically you hold the spear above yourself, and then wherever you're auto locking will generate a bunch of these spears. The problem was ultimately, the generation speed, and it would just come out a bit slowly after you do the animation, the whole thing taking a bit too long to really make for a reliable DPS, and in PvP ever really land. Something as simple as making those projectiles spawn faster as you use the Ash has had a really major impact, allowing for, if you have the window to do so, simply spamming the Ash of War at really incredible range, by the way, and dealing a lot of damage pretty consistently because of that. Then you have the basics of the weapon, which is, as a spear, a really good weapon type. You could run 2 of these for power stance, which would be a great option, but there is a nerf to this weapon type in 1.09 where they've slightly reduced the hitbox size of various attacks, meaning you don't have quite as much phantom range with spears. So like I said, this is very valuable in PvP because the Ash actually lands and can create really big pressure. Let me tell you, it's a nightmare in free-for-all, and their weapon is still very reliable as a spear in all sides of content. Number 8 on the list is the ENVOY Longhorn, which has had yet a buff in 1.09 as well. The weapon type of Great Hammer has increased speed, range, and recovery for various attacks, and they've done some attribute scaling improvements to the weapon type as a whole, so there's slightly more AR. That's very nice, but ultimately this weapon comes down to, of course, its Ash of War, where you're just spamming the bubbles and they're hitting the target at successive rates, dealing a lot of damage. The bigger the target and the more you can kind of be under them, the more burst and DPS potential you can get, as every single of these tiny little bubbles collides with the enemy at a faster rate. So against big enemies, ENVOY Longhorn remains an incredible option for dealing a staggering amount of burst. Where this weapon would struggle is ultimately against smaller enemies you can't press up against, or agile bosses where it would be a problem. And the basics of the weapon, the Great Hammer not being amazing, well, in 1.09 it is a lot better, but I do feel it was a bit too high on the list last time, and now 8 feels a lot more reasonable. Next up at number 7 is the Wing of Astel, which to my surprise received a pretty hefty buff in 1.09 for the weapon type of curved swords. They improved their running attack speed, which is wild because curved swords had one of the best power stance running attacks in the entire game, and they also improved the recovery times and increased the first attack speed of the standing combo, so it comes out quicker. I don't know, man, they were already incredible. To see buffs like this doesn't really make sense to me, but it feels great. They're hyper quick, and the Wing of Astel in particular is a very powerful DPS weapon due to its Ash of War. Simply spam it out on a target and watch them blow up at extreme rates, and even stagger. You can buff up the magic damage of this weapon type, of course, to pretty extreme rates, leading to some very, very high DPS potential. Around that really high DPS potential, Ash, though, is a really reliable weapon with its unique heavy attacks where you do these medium range magic shots, just costing stamina and no FP for whatever reason, making for an incredible tool in both PvE and PvP. It's an all-rounder, it's one of the best intelligence weapons in the game, and technically it's better this patch for some reason. Number 6 above that is what everyone argues to be the best weapon in the entire game, Blasphemous Blade. The DPS aspect of this comes down to its Ash of War, where you have a long-range fire attack, which is also quite wide-reaching. With a very simple build where you buff up and debuff the enemy, you can do really consistent damage from long range at safe points, and because the Ash of War comes out pretty quick, it's a consistent way to deal damage. Also, if you deal at melee range, you'll get the hit the weapon, which is just awesome. Also, it's a bit of an overtuned weapon as always, with lifesteal on damage, lifesteal on kill, and it works in so many builds because even if it's on your back and not directly being used, you still get many of these benefits. People last time referenced, well, if Blasphemous Blade is there for its Ash of War, why not the Ruin's Greatsword, since it has a magic version? And I just want to reference that, yeah, it should be. They're quite comparable in their ability. You can buff up fire damage to extreme rates, you can buff up magic to extreme rates. But it's true that Blasphemous Blade has more going for it, since it has lifesteal on kill and damage, which is great sustain, and therefore technically better if you're just using the Ash just for DPS. Also, Greatswords were buffed. The weapon type now has increased speed, range, and recovery time on various attacks, so somehow Blasphemous Blade is better in 1.09, which is just crazy. Moving on to number 5, we're at the Dark Moon Greatsword now, which is basically the highest damage in one hit ranged option when you do a channel heavy. You can improve this damage in so many ways with very simple builds. So by enhancing its heavy attack, by enhancing charged attacks, by enhancing its magic damage, you can send out these waves of staggering magic damage, which can also quite literally stagger enemies because of the poise damage. It's crazy, it's awesome, it looks awesome, and it works great in PvP too because you don't have to full charge, you can just tap a quick one and play mind games with a different pace. Being as it's a greatsword, it's also buffed in the same way as Blasphemous Blade, just better attack speed, range, recovery time on various attacks, so as a basic weapon, it's feeling really good. The damage is really good, and then it has one of the hardest hitting heavy attacks in the game, which is also ranged. But above that, in my opinion, is number 4, Death's Poker, which I've been severely underrating for its PvE DPS potential for a little bit too long. We had a look at this recently in a build where we tried to maximize the meta potential of the damage through lots of debuffs to enemies and self-buffing, and while there is a lot of setup with this weapon, I must admit, I was severely underrating the raw power of its Ash of War fire, where you put the fire on the ground. For whatever reason, it ticks at an extreme rate, so enemies standing inside of it just get chunked out hilariously quick. And of course, while they're standing in that fire, you can still attack them with a weapon or go for the other side of the Ash of War where you stab forward and blow up, leading to massive bursts in basically 2 Ash of War uses. If you're able to buff up your magic damage as much as possible and say stand in Terra Magica while you're doing this, it is just hilarious the amount of damage you can do with this thing. Also, you'll proc say Frost procs, dealing a nice little extra burst and also debuffing the enemy, which is phenomenal. And yeah, it's another great sword, so increased speed, range, and recovery time for various attacks with the basic weapon type itself. It's even better this patch. At number 3, we have the Power Stance REDUVIA's once again. This comes down to ultimately successive hits being insane and how quick you can attack with daggers thanks to the buffs back in 1.08. There's been no changes to this in 1.09, other than the bleed builds nerfed in general. Again, the White Mask and the Exaltation Talisman, they provide you AR when bleed procs occur, and now they provide you less AR in this patch. That does not stop this from being an incredible DPS option, it just lowers the potential burst you can get in a full Power Stance combo. Of course, there's also the Ash of War, which costs you no health to do like the normal Ash of War version, Bloodblade, working as a bleed shotgun if you use it up close, where you hit with the dagger and the Ash at the same time. Either way, this is a very versatile weapon that works incredible and is a top tier pick for PvE bleed DPS and PvP general gameplay. It is one of the better weapons in the entire game at this point. It's good to see them nerf things like bleed, as it has been king for so long, but I still feel it's basically the best status and general playstyle in a lot of sections of the game, and REDUVIA is going to be one of your best picks for that, that's for sure. At number 2, it is the Giant's Crusher one-shot. As I said, we're talking about the highest DPS and highest hit in one hit weapon options in the game, and this just remains the best in one-hit weapon in the entire game. Thanks to its unique heavy where you do the flip slam, deals extra damage on that. You can buff up the raw damage of this weapon to extreme levels, and I did a whole building video about that where we did about 16k in one hit. People mentioned that that requires a lot of buffing and isn't really viable, and it's exactly what I said in the video, except you can easily tone this back to say 3 or 4k a single hit with the heavy attack, while also giving yourself really heavy armor and therefore loads of poise to ignore whatever the boss is doing and just keeps flip slamming for massive damage over and over. That'll also stagger bosses and lead to criticals or more flip slams. It's just ridiculously strong. I also tested it in PvP recently just to see how the bland moveset works there still, and with some very basic mind games and looking for, good trades, it still absolutely chunks out health, and there's a lot of great Ashes of War to help you get those opportunities. So it's feeling incredible still, and it's not really changed this patch. And number 1 though is still MARAIS Executioner Sword. We could also mention the straight sword version, the Regalia, but this is the strongest version as it hits the heaviest with its corkscrew style ranged Ash of War. Thanks to some very simple buffs and successive hits, your AR will skyrocket after you use this and hit many times in a row, and then if you can get a second one off, pretty much anything is just going to be dead. The damage you can get with this is hilarious. The only real criticism for this is if a boss evades out of the Ash of War, but we could say that for everything. If you miss the attack, you miss the attack. The DPS potential ultimately is really high on this weapon, and what's great about it is it doesn't rely on bleed in any way. So it's probably going to be one of the best DPS options going into the DLC whenever that comes, since they might put, say, bleed resistant bosses in the game or reduce bleed power even further in future patches. I just don't see this one being addressed or touched in any way. And as a greatsword, it's still got the same weapon type buff we've mentioned, the better speed, range, recovery on various attacks, so it's technically better this patch as well. It also works in PvP because they gave it an ability to roll out cancel if you do miss the Ash of War, so it's feeling phenomenal. But there you have it. Those are my 10 top suggestions for DPS weapons in Elden Ring right now. A nice variety of playstyles for you to consider. Let me know what you think, and are there any weapons that I've missed out on that could have been mentioned? For now, I've been Hollow, you've been you. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.